In the evening of July the 23rd, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 is cruising high above central Canada. The aircraft, only a few months old, is among the newest and most advanced in the airline's fleet, and in the cockpit, the crew is monitoring a panel equipped with gleaming new digital displays. Behind them, 61 passengers and 8 crew have settled in for a quiet evening flight from Ottawa over to Edmonton, unaware that they're soon about to take part in one of aviation's most extraordinary stories. The two pilots are both extremely experienced, with thousands of total hours each under their belt, but both of them with less than 200 hours on this new Boeing 767. About 30 minutes into the cruise, a warning light suddenly appears, one that should never appear in cruise, and one that instantly makes the heart sink in the chest of the pilots, for reasons that will soon become obvious. The Boeing 767 was a new kind of airplane for Air Canada back in 1983. Sleek, efficient and packed with early digital technology, it was the pride of their fleet, and it represented a big leap forward from their older DC-8s and 727s that had previously defined the airline's long-haul services. The aircraft involved in this story had the registration Charlie, Golf Alpha Uniform November, and was only the second 767 delivered to Air Canada at the time. Barely 2 months old, it was equipped with a modern glass cockpit that had replaced most analog dials with glowing cathode ray displays that could display everything from fuel totals to engine parameters. And for the first time on an Air Canada widebody, there was no flight engineer on board. Just 2 pilots seated side by side with their flight management system tying all of the information together automatically, calculating fuel burn, range, climb and descent profiles. Now, this automation was meant to reduce workload, but it also meant that the crews were now more dependent than ever on accurate digital information. If one layer of data was wrong, there now wasn't always an independent human backup system to catch it. And this new system was also vulnerable to the age-old principle of garbage in, garbage out, meaning that if you put bad information into the computer, the system wouldn't be able to highlight that. It would just run with what the pilots had put in. And as it turns out, all was not well with this particular aircraft. The first hints of trouble had actually appeared quietly weeks before this flight. On July the 5th, 1983, while undergoing a maintenance check in Edmonton, the fuel gauges had suddenly gone blank, meaning that the display, which normally showed the contents of the 767's 3 fuel tanks, suddenly couldn't be used. Now, each gauge would normally show the weight of fuel in the left, center and right tanks, using data gathered from dozens of sensors inside of each tank routed to a central processor, which then converted those readings into useful information. And that data flowed along 2 redundant electronic paths, known as Channel 1 and Channel 2, either one of which could run the whole system alone. So in theory, no single failure should ever cause a total blackout of the gauges, yet that was now exactly what had happened. It later turned out that the underlying failure was deceptively simple. Inside the fuel quantity processor, a small solder joint connecting an induction coil to its terminal block on channel 2 had started to break down. And that single weak connection disrupted the power flow to the logic circuit, which was the part of the computer meant to recognize faults, store error codes, and automatically switch control over to the healthy channel 1. Because of that design flaw, the system never completed the automatic transfer. Instead, it stayed locked on to the bad channel, even though the other one was perfectly fine, and the gauges therefore went dark. In Edmonton, one of the technicians eventually discovered a way around this. He pulled the circuit breakers for both channels and then reset the breaker for channel 1 only. Doing that forced the processor to reboot on the good side and brought the fuel displays back to life again, effectively forcing the computer to perform the changeover that it was supposed to have made automatically. Now, the technician knew that the processor still needed to be replaced, but unfortunately no spare units were available. In fact, Air Canada's sole spare fuel quantity processor was at that time overseas, participating in a manufacturer test program. And when it had been recalled, it arrived defective and therefore had to be sent back for repair, meaning that the whole fleet was effectively without a backup. So, following the airline's minimum equipment list, or MEL, the technician tagged the Channel 2 breaker with a yellow band, placed a C logbook placard above the gauges, and then logged his work, with a note in the logbook showing where in the MEL the conditions were written for how to operate the plane with this system fault. You see, the MEL, which is always kept on board, shows exactly what system must work for dispatch and what extra steps are required if something doesn't. And under this item, the airplane could still fly with one FQIS channel inoperative, provided that the fuel gauges still displayed fuel and that a manual dripstick check of the fuel load was performed to replace the lost redundancy. The logbook note also said that this MEL allowance applied until a replacement processor was installed. The following morning, that same technician was still on duty when the new crew arrived, so he briefed the captain about the situation, explaining that Channel 2 was out and that the system was running normally on Channel 1. The aircraft then continued to operate under this condition, but on July the 14th, near the end of a flight over to San Francisco, the gauges then went blank again. The crew landed safely and called for maintenance to come and look at the problem, and they ended up removing the processor for bench testing, during which it started working fine again. So with no active fault to diagnose, the technicians just reinstalled it and deferred further action, with the aircraft returning to service that same day, seemingly fixed. That was a decision that was fully logical at the time, but one that also allowed this intermittent fault to continue to lurk in the background. The airplane then flew on to Ottawa and Montreal that same day without any further indication of any kind of trouble, but obviously with each stop still requiring a manual dripstick check, as I mentioned before. So what was that then? Well, a dripstick check is actually quite a time-consuming procedure where little panels on the underside of the wings have to be opened to allow a little measuring stick to drop down. That stick is then connected to a float inside of the tank, which gives a direct measurement of the fuel depth in centimeters at that location in the tank. These measurements are then combined and converted into liters and then into kilograms using specific density charts. And this whole procedure normally takes a good 45 minutes to an hour to do on most aircraft, so this must have been quite a nuisance for everyone involved. Now, when I'm creating these videos, I am constantly reminded that aviation is full of complex calculations, systems and engineering, many of which require a fundamental understanding of things like maths and physics, as you will soon see. That's why I am so happy to have Brilliant as the sponsor for this episode, as that is exactly where they really shine. Brilliant explains subjects like maths, science and problem solving through short interactive lessons that truly make ideas click. No long lectures or dry textbooks, just hands-on exercises that build real intuition, and I can tell you that it's really satisfying when a concept finally falls into place. I have recently been going through their scientific thinking course myself, and they do a great job of breaking things down visually. Circuits, gears, structures, all of the things that make you think like an engineer again. And you don't need much time to do this. Even a quick break is enough to jump into a lesson and actually learn something, and that is what will keep your analytical pilot brain engaged without feeling like it's work. Now, if you want to try this for yourself, Brilliant is offering 20% off their annual premium plan, which grants unlimited daily access for you Mentor Pilot viewers. It is a great way to refresh old skills, pick up new ones, or just enjoy learning again, which, as this video will soon show you, is really important. So just scan this QR code or go to brilliant.org/mentorpilot via the link in the description below and start learning for free. And use my link to get the most out of it. Thank you, Brilliant. Now let's get back to how the crew felt about that dripstick check. So this must have been quite a nuisance for everyone involved. Anyway, every time that this was done, the measured and calculated fuel figures matched the fuel gauges in the cockpit, so the aircraft could continue to operate. 9 days later, on July the 23rd in Edmonton, this defect then appeared again during a service check in the morning before the first flight was due. This time, the same technician that had come up with a solution last time carefully repeated his earlier steps with the two circuit breakers, and the gauges soon came back on, confirming that the failure was still in channel 2. So he tagged that breaker out of service and recorded a fresh techlog entry, citing the same MEL provisions as before. But it is really super important to point out here that this provision in the MEL still maintained redundancy and absolutely did not allow a total loss of fuel indication in the cockpit. If that would happen, the aircraft would be grounded, as no indication would be available for the pilots during flight. Anyway, once he was done, the engineer spoke to the outgoing crew and explained the issue. But a small misunderstanding now happened when the new captain heard that the engineer had worked on this problem before. You see, hearing that, the captain assumed that the aircraft had been operating with this fault also during the previous day, which was not the case. Now, for the coming 2 flights, that would not really matter, but it later would. The morning pilots then read through the MEL, verified that the gauges were working and that the dripstick test had been done, and then happily flew the west to east flight over to Montreal without any further incident, its gauges still working perfectly using channel 1. But after the shutdown at Dorval Airport and before the next crew would arrive for the afternoon shift, another avionics technician decided to dig a bit deeper into the issue, hoping to verify the first technician's diagnosis. So, alone in the cockpit, he re-engaged the tagged channel 2 breaker to power up both sides of the system at once, and when he did so, the gauges immediately went blank again. He then confirmed the fault via something known as a BITE, built-in test equipment test, which is an internal self-test circuit handled from the FMC, and he finished by entering his findings into the logbook. But before he could reset the circuit breakers in the same way that he had found them, he was called away to assist with the manual dripstick test, which meant that the original fault stayed in and the fuel gauges therefore stayed blank. Now, the logbook entries clearly described the situation, but the details of which circuit breaker had been left in or out were buried several pages back, and crucially, another thing that was also left out was exactly what the circuit breaker fix was trying to do. So with this, the stage was now set for a cascade of small further misunderstandings and errors, but I really want to emphasize here that this should not normally have been a problem. The MEL clearly stated that the aircraft was not allowed to dispatch with blank fuel gauges. So for that to happen, and for things to become truly dangerous, several other things also now had to fall in place. And they were soon about to. That afternoon, the airplane was assigned to operate as Air Canada Flight 143, routing from Montreal to Ottawa and then onwards to Edmonton. The crew scheduled to do this actually met the morning crew casually outside of the terminal in the parking lot and started discussing the aircraft status. This was a kind of impromptu and informal handoff, but one that would soon prove fateful. Without the logbook or the MEL in front of them, the outgoing pilots mentioned that the airplane had experienced a fuel gauge problem that required manual checking of the tanks, and they also noted that it had been flying in that condition since the previous day, with everything going smoothly. Now, that brief exchange, spoken from memory after a long day of duty, was factually quite correct, except it hadn't been flying with the problem that long and lacked a bit of detail. But since the outgoing captain had mentioned issues with the fuel gauges, the new pilots now walked away with the incorrect belief that the fuel gauges had been completely inoperative for at least 2 days. And also that this had been cleared by maintenance and operations. Now, as we all know, that wasn't really the case, but an assumption can be a very powerful thing. I should also mention here that in this airline at the time, there existed a lingering belief that the maintenance headquarters, known as Maintenance Central, had the ability to override parts of the MEL using a sort of master MEL that could be used in special situations. Now, that wasn't actually true, but years earlier, before the MEL became legally binding, such exceptions had indeed been made from time to time. And those stories had stuck around, with many crews still believing that higher approval, maybe directly from the aircraft manufacturer, could make an aircraft legal, even if the aircraft's MEL said that it couldn't. So in this case, when these new pilots now boarded the plane, their expectations were instantly confirmed. The 3 fuel quantity indicators were indeed blank, and in their minds that had been okay for the last few days, so it should be okay for them as well. The placard above the gauges and the MEL reference in the logbook actually reinforced that belief, since at a glance it seemed to confirm that the gauges were inoperative, but in reality that note was referring to the faulty channel. And what they obviously had no idea about was that a technician had just accidentally powered both channels up, knocking the system out entirely and changing the situation from what the previous crew had had. So from the perspective of this flight crew, the paperwork matched what they expected. The gauges were blank, the appropriate section of the MEL was cited, and when the captain read through the MEL and queried the local technician about the discrepancy around the fuel gauges, he just said that the aircraft was okay to fly, likely based on its previous status, which the captain accepted, thinking that the maintenance central knew more than he did. Today, the rules in these situations are crystal clear. If a system is inoperative and the MEL says that it's required for dispatch, no pilot will accept it. But like I said, these rules were likely a bit more fussy back then. Now, what I, as an active pilot, just cannot understand though is how a captain could accept an aircraft without any in-flight fuel indication at all. I mean, checking the fuel on the ground is okay, but what if a fuel leak or an imbalance would then develop in the air? Without any type of indication, that would be impossible to diagnose. In any case, the captain did also spot the colored circuit breaker mentioned in the tech log, but missed that it hadn't been pulled. And in any case, he likely assumed that it was for the fuel gauges and therefore was doing what it was supposed to. So at this point, you can see how these pilots accepted the blank fuel gauges, but it hadn't become truly dangerous yet. That came when they sat down and reviewed their fuel planning. In order to try and avoid another refueling in Ottawa, they decided to uplift enough fuel to carry them through both the leg over to Ottawa and then onwards to Edmonton. To do that, they calculated that they needed 22,300 kilograms of fuel, and to make sure that they had that, they first had to determine how much fuel they already had on board and then uplift the difference. Since the gauges were blank, the only way to know how much they had was by doing that dripstick test. But that test result then had to be converted from centimeters on the stick into liters and then into kilos. Below them, 2 ground engineers had soon completed the drip check, recording 64 centimeters in the left tank and 62 centimeters in the right. So, by consulting the conversion tables, they determined that this corresponded to 3,924 liters and 3,758 liters respectively, which meant that the plane had 7,682 liters in total on board. But that was liters, so they now needed to verify how much that was in kilos in order to adhere to the flight plan. Now, it might surprise some of you to hear me talking about centimeters and liters, since aviation back then tended to use US units, especially in North America. But these Boeing 767s were a little bit unique to the Air Canada fleet. You see, the 767 was the first new model to enter service since Canada had begun its official transition over to the metric system, and the government had pushed for metric instrumentation wherever international standards would allow it, which obviously included the country's flag carrier, which was still owned by the state back in 1983. In practice though, this conversion into metric was inconsistent. On the 767, the fuel gauges, manuals and dripsticks were calibrated in kilograms, liters and centimeters, but almost everything else, like altitude, range and speed, remained in feet, nautical miles and knots, just like any other Western airliner. Normally, none of this mattered, because the airplane's computers automatically showed kilograms on the gauges, making manual fuel conversions rare and only really needed when the automatic system failed. But that was obviously now the case. Now, during the transition onto the metric system, Air Canada had also created an unfortunate knowledge gap. No one had been trained to actually do these manual conversions, and it wasn't clear whether that task belonged to the flight crews or to maintenance. So back at this aircraft, one of the ground engineers asked the fueler on duty for the proper conversion factor from liters over to kilos, and the fueler just checked on his chart and replied 1.77. But that factor, 1.77, was actually the conversion factor from liters of Jet A1 fuel into pounds, not kilograms. And since no one knew how to do this correctly, that fact was never noticed. 1.77 had come from the fueler's own density reference card, which was a laminated slip used for the rest of Air Canada's fleet, where fuel quantities were still recorded in pounds. The correct factor should have been 0.8 kilos per liter, meaning an almost 50% difference. Now, as crazy as this sounds, this was a quite understandable mistake. The 767's measurement in kilograms was an oddity in the fleet, and the fueler's job here was not to understand the intricacies of every plane's fuel system, it was just to put in exactly as much fuel as the crew requested. So unaware of this trap, the ground engineers now multiplied by hand 7,682 liters by 1.77, arriving at 13,597 kilograms of fuel on board. But if they would have used the correct conversion, they would have arrived at the correct figure of about 6,160 kilograms instead. The pilots eventually confirmed the result with their own sums and the use of a slide ruler, and then subtracted the result from their target of 22,300 kilos. So by their reckoning, they needed to add another 8,703 kilos of fuel to cover the two coming flights. And in order to change that back into liters for the fueler, they then converted that figure using the same incorrect constant. 8,703 divided by 1.77 equals 4,916 liters. So after rounding that up, they ordered 5,000 liters of additional fuel. In reality, they actually needed 20,200 liters, but because they had now mixed pounds and kilograms, the numbers seemed entirely plausible. And since they probably weren't that used to metric units, the figure didn't stand out to them as absurd either. The absurdity would have been caught if the fuel gauges were working, but remember, they were still blank. All of this meant that when the fueling was complete, the airplane had about 10,146 kilos of fuel in its tanks instead of the required 22,300 kilos. And ironically, the number 10,146 kilos is almost exactly 22,300 pounds, forming a perfect numerical coincidence that possibly further disguised this error. The pilots now, again, reviewed their paperwork and everything looked completely normal. The MAL reference appeared in the log, the required drip test had been completed, and everything matched their expectations, including the still blank gauges. From a procedural standpoint, the airplane was in the captain's eyes legal to fly, since he felt that he had checked this with Maintenance Central and thought that they had confirmed it, even though that was obviously not the case. But you can clearly here see how confirmation bias once again creeps in and how insidious it can really be. This captain was a seasoned pro who would never have accepted the aircraft if he actually thought that it wasn't legal to fly. But his and his colleagues' assumptions, together with a lack of knowledge of the metric system and that small fault in the number 2 fuel meter channel, had now been combined into something truly monstrous. At noon local time, Air Canada Flight 143 then pushed back from Gate 47 at Montreal Dorval Airport, and the brand new Boeing 767, gleaming in red and white, soon taxied out under the bright summer skies. And to anyone watching, this looked like just another routine departure of Air Canada's newest jetliner. The aircraft soon lined up and began its takeoff roll with all systems showing completely normal values. The fuel value in the FMC must have been entered manually and was therefore ticking down from a faulty start value. The flight over to Ottawa then went off without a single problem. A barely half an hour long domestic leg meant to pick up some more passengers before starting the longer westbound flight over to Edmonton. Once parked at the gate in Ottawa, the airplane then went through its usual turnaround. Some passengers got off, others boarded, and the crew prepared for the coming sector across the prairies. Now, because the gauges were still blank, another manual dripstick check was required before departure, and Out on the ramp, the procedure now played out exactly as it had before. The engineers pulled out the measuring sticks, read the fuel depths, and then used the same tables to convert them over to liters. And that was then followed by the crucial step of turning those liters into kilograms, likely the last chance to catch that previous mistake. But instead, the same error was now repeated, using the same erroneous conversion factor. This finally verified to all involved that the aircraft already had more than enough fuel to reach Edmonton, so no refueling was required. Now, along the way, one of them could have done some simple reasoning and realized the problem here. A single liter of water weighs 1 kilogram, and jet fuel is actually a little bit less dense than water, so a liter of fuel weighing nearly 2 kilograms made no sense. But no one made that connection. This meant that at 1900 local time, Air Canada Flight 143 taxied out from the Ottawa apron into the warm evening light. The big twin jet then started accelerating and soon lifted easily into the sky, climbing westwards towards Manitoba, with the captain as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. The climb was uneventful, and the crew soon settled into cruise, chatting with an Air Canada engineer who happened to be on board and comparing notes with him about the new 767's technical systems. Behind them, the passengers relaxed, happily unaware that the airplane's fuel supply was now less than half of what it should have been, and slowly running out. But for now, the aircraft continued pulling forward through the thin air at 41,000 feet. Ahead and below them lay more than 1,000 miles of empty Canadian plains, rivers and lakes, forming some of the most beautiful landscapes on Earth. In the cockpit, the two pilots continued their discussion with the engineer until suddenly a warning light activated above the left engine display saying low fuel pressure. The horrific underlying meaning of that light was likely instantly obvious. With no fuel gauges and a long chain of manual fuel calculations behind them, the most likely explanation was the one that no pilot wants to hear. Somewhere, something had gone wrong, and they were now running out of fuel. The crew had discussed diversions options earlier, as we tend to do during cruise in case something would happen, and now, with one engine about to fail, the decision came instantly. They needed to first descend and then likely diverge towards Winnipeg, which at this time was about 120 nautical miles away. The first officer requested a diversion from air traffic control, which was approved, and then they also received a clearance to descend down to flight level 350, or 35,000 feet. Maybe they still had enough fuel on board to make it. But only a few minutes later, as the aircraft started leveling off, this hope was quashed when the left engine finally ran out of fuel and failed. At this point, the aircraft was still about 65 miles away from Winnipeg, and before the crew had time to discuss a drift-down procedure or even run through the engine failure checklist, the right engine also flamed out. Everything now immediately became eerily quiet. The only thing that could be heard was the wind swishing past the windscreen, and in the cabin behind them, it would have become even quieter, with the emergency lighting suddenly activating. Without any kind of propulsion, Flight 143 was now subject to the laws of physics alone, which at this time represented a nearly unprecedented emergency. You see, back in 1983, no prescribed procedure for flying and landing without engines even existed. The idea of a dual engine failure on a wide-body jet was so outside the realm of imagination that no one had even come up with a checklist for what to do. Without the engines turning, there was nothing powering the generators either, and the APU generator in the back of the aircraft was equally useless since it relied on the same fuel supply as the engines did. So all that initially remained for the pilots to work with were a few basic analog backups, like an attitude indicator, an altimeter, an airspeed indicator, a magnetic compass and a radio, which were running off the onboard battery. But the situation would have been even worse if it weren't for the existence of the ram air turbine, or RAT. That's a small backup device that exists precisely for situations like this. It's basically a small propeller that, when certain activation criteria are met, automatically drops down into the airstream, and once activated, it generates enough power to keep the hydraulic pumps running, and without it, the pilots of Flight 143 would not have even been able to move the 767's massive control surfaces. But keeping the unpowered plane under control was only the first of their problems. Now they also needed to land it. You see, an airliner without engine power will descend at a fairly constant rate once it's back to the up speed. That's the lowest speed without flaps. And that means that the descent can be calculated and controlled, but the much more difficult part is nailing what we call a dead stick landing in the right place. You will obviously only get one shot at the approach, and because your range is constantly narrowing, pilots have to make a smart decision about the landing site relatively quickly and then leave themselves sufficient time to line up with the runway without inadvertently committing to a destination that is too far away. In fact, when we practice this in the simulator, most people end up a bit too high just because they don't want to come up short. But that then comes with a whole host of other problems, as we will soon see. In a dual engine failure scenario today, we also have to do memory items, meaning critical items that needs to be done from memory to try and get at least one engine started again. But of course, in this case, that would not have been possible, because there was no fuel left. At the time, there had not been a lot of examples of crews facing a dual engine flameout that had successfully landed. Southern Airways Flight 242, for instance, had lost both engines in a hailstorm over Georgia back in 1977 and had then been forced to land on a highway after the pilots spent too long heading for an airport that was out of range. And that resulted in a tragic accident killing 72 people. Pan International 112 also lost both engines immediately after takeoff and was forced onto a similar situation. The pilots attempted to land on the Autobahn, but the plane then slid into a bridge and broke apart, killing 22 of the passengers on board. Those examples just show that in situations like this, quick and accurate decision making is key, but even with that, things might still not work out as planned. In this case though, the flight crew had the benefit of time since they were at high altitude, and they quickly determined that they only had 2 landing sites to choose from. Looking at their glide ratio, which in most airliners would give about 3 miles per 1,000 feet of lost altitude, would in theory put Winnipeg 65 miles away within their range. And that was a full-service international airport with long runways and fire crews standing by. The second option was a former Royal Canadian Air Force base at Gimli, roughly 45 miles away near the western shore of Lake Winnipeg. The first officer had actually trained there years earlier and still remembered the layout. Twin runways, each about 7,200 feet or 2,100 meters long. But no one knew whether those runways at Gimli were still maintained or even open. When asked, air traffic control wasn't even able to find any records of services on that site at all, so Winnipeg was a safer bet, but also further away. The deciding factor, though, between both of these two alternates ultimately became distance. With no vertical speed indicator, the first officer had to start calculating their descent rate by hand. So he held a notepad on his knee, noting down their altitude each time ATC gave a new distance to Winnipeg. And using simple arithmetics, he worked out how many feet they were losing per nautical mile, and from that, how far they could still travel. And those numbers soon told a brutally honest story. With the descent rate that they were keeping, they would fall short of Winnipeg by more than 20 miles. Gimli, though, was within range, which finally made that choice obvious. So they informed ATC and began a gentle right turn towards the lake, scanning for the field. Far off in the horizon, they could now see Winnipeg's runways glinting in the evening sun, taunting them with a relative safety that was now just out of their reach. But knowing how pilots think, that likely didn't bother them. They would have been 100% focused on the task at hand, to get this aircraft down safely. Behind them in the cabin, the sudden silence had not gone unnoticed. The airflow still swooshed outside, the emergency lights gleamed, and the passengers exchanged worried looks with each other. A few of them actually wrote hurried notes to loved ones, others prayed, and the flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, tightening seatbelts and giving instructions for the coming emergency landing. As the Gimli Air Base finally came into view, the first thing that the pilot noticed was how small it looked. Gimli's twin runways were far shorter than those at Winnipeg, and they had no idea what conditions they were actually in. When it became clear that they would reach it, the pilots started configuring for landing as best as they could, but with no engine power, the hydraulic pumps were barely keeping up, and the ram air turbine couldn't run all of the systems by itself. For example, it couldn't power the circuits for the flaps or slats, which meant that the captain now had to plan a landing without them, meaning a much higher speed and nose attitude than normal. The first officer, who was working through the checklists, therefore skipped over the flaps and went straight on to trying to lower the landing gear, but then quickly discovered a new problem. The main hydraulic system that drove the landing gear actuators was also not working. Now that doesn't surprise me at all, since most airliners use an emergency, gravity and airflow fed extension system for gear extensions in situations like this. So the first officer now quickly moved over to pull the alternate gear extension handles, releasing the uplock that held the gear in place. With a metallic thud, the main gear fell down and locked into place, and the nose gear also came down, but without enough force to lock it properly into place. But there was no more options left. It would just have to do. Up ahead, the Gimli base now grew larger, with the late evening sun glinting off the pavement, and as the aircraft started to line up with the runway, the captain realized that they were way too high. If they continued at their current glide path, they would overshoot the field entirely, but also, if they pitched down too steeply, they would gain so much speed that they'd never stop on the short available runway. So this meant that they now needed to lose altitude fast, but to do that without picking up speed, without having access to normal drag additives like flaps and spoilers. But fortunately, they did have one important thing working for them. The captain had years of glider experience under his belt, and he knew a maneuver that could do exactly what they needed: a forward slip. This is a maneuver where you introduce rudder together with opposite aileron to still keep the track, and together this will cause the body of the aircraft to hit the airstream and develop a sudden high amount of drag. This technique is often used in gliders and smaller single-engine aircraft, but never in airliners, as the wake caused by the body would go straight into the downwind engine, potentially causing compressor stalls. And on top of that, it will also cause an extra rolling motion due to the aerodynamics of the swept wings, but to a slightly smaller extent. In this case though, the engines had already died, so the issues would be less severe, and the increased drag would make the jet descend steeply without accelerating. After informing the first officer of what he planned to do, the captain therefore kicked the rudder hard to the right and simultaneously rolled the ailerons left to keep the track of the aircraft down towards the runway. The huge 767 banked sharply, with the nose now more than 45 degrees off the centerline. And this also meant that the passengers on the left-hand side now suddenly saw nothing but ground out through their windows, and on the right, only sky. This maneuver would have also jolted the passengers to the left in their seats, since it's not an aerodynamically coordinated maneuver, meaning it would have felt quite nasty. But in the cockpit, the altimeter now started decreasing rapidly, with the speed still under control. And with the runway now rushing up towards them, the captain soon rolled level again, guiding the nose back towards the centerline. And only then did he realize that something else was off. The runway markings on the concrete in front of them didn't match what they would see on a runway. In fact, it wasn't a runway at all. You see, the decommissioned airbase had since become a motorsport park, and the strip that they were now lined up with was a drag racing track. At the far end, spectators, campers and two young boys on bicycles were all filling up the runway, but there was now nothing that the captain could do. He was committed. And from the side of the people on the ground, this would have looked absolutely surreal. At first, the aircraft would have looked like just a speck in the bright July sky, maybe a glint of metal descending down towards them. But then, the contour of the enormous aircraft would have slowly started to take shape, with its wings steady, heading straight towards them, but with its engines eerily silent. So as the aircraft descended the last few hundred feet down towards the runway, the people along the far end of the drag strip began pointing towards it, with the sound of conversation fast fading as the giant aircraft swept lower, only accompanied by the rush of air around it. The main wheels soon touched down within what should have been the touchdown zone, and as the weight came down, the captain held the nose back for as long as possible. But eventually, it slammed down into the pavement and started dragging over the concrete with sparks flying everywhere. Spectators at the far end now scattered in all directions, campers dove for cover, and the two boys pedaled desperately towards the side of the runway as the plane skidded towards them. Inside the cabin, the passengers braced against their seats, with the screech of the friction likely being the only thing they could hear. The captain continued to push the brakes, using every ounce of remaining hydraulic pressure to slow the airplane down, and in a stroke of luck, the collapsed nose gear likely provided some extra braking here. After 12 agonizing seconds, the giant Boeing 767 finally shuddered to a stop, only a short distance away from the shocked crowd. For a long moment, no one moved. The air smelled of rubber and scorched metal, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the flags as hundreds of people tried to make sense of what they were seeing. A brand new wide-body jet, sitting silently tilted forward on their drag strip. Initially, no one inside of the plane quite realized that they had made it. That was until a clear voice came out over the PA saying, "This is the captain, evacuate the aircraft." The flight attendants now leaped into action, quickly opening the doors and deploying the slides to get everyone off. And in the front and over the wings, the slides inflated normally and passengers slid to the ground in an orderly fashion. But in the back, the slides failed to reach the ground because of the plane's nose-down attitude. So passengers there quickly jumped down, some twisting their ankles as they did and others helping each other out. Outside, people from the nearby camping grounds and race pits now rushed forward, some with fire extinguishers in hand. A small fire had started near the nose but was quickly smothered, and within minutes all 69 occupants of the aircraft were safely down on the ground. Against all of the odds, the brand new Boeing 767, with both engines dead, had landed safely with no fatalities and only minor injuries. An absolutely incredible feat. When rescue crews finally arrived from Winnipeg, they found the world's newest airliner just sitting on the drag strip, its nose scraped flat, its red and white fuselage intact, and its crew already surrounded by disbelieving onlookers. In the aftermath, investigators quickly realized that what had happened to Flight 143 was more than just a story of pilot skills and individual mistakes. It was actually a story of systems that hadn't quite caught up with the technology that they supported. The official inquiry found that no single person was to blame for what had happened. The airplane had done exactly what its logic circuits allowed, the technicians had followed the book as they understood it, and the pilots had done their best with the information in front of them. In response to this, Air Canada overhauled its technical manuals and grounded its remaining 767s until everyone was thoroughly briefed on how the new metric systems worked. Conversions between liters, kilograms and pounds were standardized, with laminated cards posted in every cockpit and fueling station, and the once casual practice of relying on fuelers' density charts was replaced with precise temperature-corrected figures printed directly from dispatch software. This incident also caused a number of technical changes. The avionics were redesigned so that a single channel failure could no longer knock out both sides of the system, and Boeing issued service bulletins requiring these upgrades to be implemented fleet-wide. For the crew though, the consequences were a bit mixed. Both pilots were initially suspended during the investigation, but they were later reinstated. And far from being disgraced, they actually then received the first ever Federación Aeronautica Internazionale Diploma for Outstanding Airmanship in 1985. Their judgment and airmanship in converting a powerless wide-body jet into a glider and then landing it without loss of life became a case study in crew coordination and crisis management. And what about the aircraft? Well, after some fixes to its nose gear and body, it was soon flown out of Gimli and then went on to serve another 25 years before its retirement in 2008. In the end, the Gimli Glider story stands not just as a testament to skill, but as proof that even the most advanced systems still rely on clarity, communication, as well as a little bit of human instinct. And sometimes, when everything else fails, gravity, communication, skills and good judgment can still be enough to bring you home safely. Now, this was a completely new version of the video that I made very early on in my channel's history when I didn't have access to the kind of graphics and editing that I now have. And let me know if there are any other earlier stories that you'd like me to improve on. I would love to hear your thoughts. You can also tell me that directly by supporting my team and joining my Patreon crew. And you can do so by scanning this QR code or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I'm getting ready for another Zoom hangout soon and would love to see you there with your questions. And also, remember to check out the exclusive deal that I have from my sponsor, because that also really helps the channel. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.